snowdrift swallowed houses whole, trapping families in freezing darkness for 11 days. While modern generators failed and expensive pipes burst, a 62-year-old widow sat sipping hot tea in a sweltering living room. Her secret? An oddly bizarre DIY project her wealthy neighbors had spent all summer mocking. Beatrice Miller was not a crazy woman, though by late July, the affluent residents of Pine Ridge, Montana, had firmly decided otherwise. Pine Ridge had changed over the last decade. What used to be a rugged logging town had been discovered by out-of-state remote workers and wealthy retirees seeking a picturesque mountain lifestyle. They brought with them modern architecture, strict homeowner association mentalities, and a deep detachment from the brutal reality of the Rocky Mountain winters. Beatrice, or Bea, to the few old-timers left, lived in a modest single-story 1970s ranch house at the end of Juniper Lane. 2 years prior, she had lost her husband Thomas to a sudden heart attack. Since then, the neighborhood had watched her with a mix of pity and quiet judgment. But the pity evaporated the day the lumber truck arrived. It started on a sweltering Tuesday. Dave Carmichael, the local hardware store owner, delivered stacks of rough-sawn 2x4s, corrugated tin roofing, and heavy-duty deck screws to Bea's driveway. By Wednesday, Bea was out in the baking sun with a circular saw and a drill, framing a structure that left the neighborhood baffled. She wasn't building a detached shed in the backyard. She was building a massive, continuous lean-to that hugged the entire perimeter of her house. Gary and Brenda Carter, who lived directly across the street in a towering, custom-built modern farmhouse with floor-to-ceiling windows, were the first to object. Gary, a regional manager for a software firm, took pride in his manicured lawn and the aesthetic perfection of Juniper Lane. "What in God's name is she doing?" Gary muttered one Saturday morning, standing on his pristine mahogany porch with a mug of artisanal coffee. He watched as Bea, wearing dusty overalls and a faded baseball cap, hoisted a sheet of tin roofing over the wooden frame attached just below her home's eaves. The structure extended outward about 4 feet from her exterior walls. It had no walls of its own, just sturdy wooden pillars supporting a slanted tin roof that wrapped around her living room, kitchen, and bedroom walls. A week later, the real madness began. Loggers from the next county over started dumping massive piles of unsplit tamarack and Douglas fir in Bea's front yard. For 12 hours a day, the sharp thwack of a splitting maul echoed through the valley. Bea was splitting the wood and stacking it tightly, floor to ceiling, under the newly built wraparound roof. By August, Bea's house looked like a timber fortress. The cordwood was stacked so densely against the exterior walls that you could barely see her original siding. Gary couldn't take it anymore. He marched across the asphalt, his expensive boat shoes slapping the ground with righteous indignation. "Bea, good morning." Gary forced a painfully artificial smile. "Just, admiring the handiwork. What exactly is this? Are we preparing for a medieval siege?" Bea paused, wiping sweat from her brow with a bandana. She rested her hands on her maul and looked Gary dead in the eye. "It's a woodshed, Gary. Putting it against the house keeps the wood dry, and the wood keeps the house warm. Old-timer's trick. Thomas and I always talked about doing it. I figured this was the year." Gary let out a condescending chuckle. "Bea, come on. It's an eyesore. It looks like a hillbilly barricade. Not to mention you're inviting every termite and carpenter ant in Montana directly into your foundation. My smart thermostat handles the winter just fine. We have dual zone heating now. You don't need to turn your house into a lumber yard." "Termites don't care for dry tamarack," Bea replied calmly, picking up a heavy split log and wedging it tightly into the stack covering her north-facing wall. "And when the grid goes down, your smart thermostat isn't going to be very smart." Gary scoffed, shaking his head. "The grid here was upgraded 3 years ago, Bea. Look, Renda is having the garden club over next week and staring out at this. It's bringing down the property value of the whole street." "Nah, all right, but then Brenda should look the other way, Bea said, turning her back to him and swinging the mole down with a resounding crack. Gary didn't let it go. By early September, he had filed a formal complaint with the county zoning board. He claimed Bea's structure was a fire hazard and a violation of local setback ordinances. The neighborhood rumor mill churned violently. Brenda told anyone who would listen at the grocery store that Bea had finally lost her marbles from the grief of losing Thomas. 2 weeks later, Craig Peterson, the county building inspector, pulled up in his white municipal truck. Craig was notoriously strict, a man who loved the petty power his badge afforded him. Gary stood on his porch, grinning, expecting to see Bea handed a massive fine and a demolition order. Craig swaggered up the driveway with his clipboard. Bea met him on the porch. "Mrs. Miller," Craig said, tapping his pen against his board. "Got a complaint about an illegal, unpermitted addition to the primary dwelling." Bea didn't flinch. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. "It's not an addition, Craig. It's a temporary weather awning with no permanent foundation, and the cordwood is technically classified as temporary outdoor storage. According to Section 4, Paragraph B of the County Code, as long as it doesn't encroach on the street right-of-way, which it doesn't, I measured, no permit is required." Craig blinked, adjusting his sunglasses. He walked the perimeter, kicking the tightly stacked wood, trying to find a code violation, but the framing was solid, the roof was pitched perfectly to shed snow away from the foundation, and there was no electrical or plumbing involved. "It's a fire hazard," Craig tried half-heartedly. "It's 15 feet from the property line," Bea counted. "Standard for firewood storage. You can cite me if you want, Craig, but I'll take it to the county judge, and you know old Judge Harrison buys his firewood from the same logger I do." Craig grumbled, scribbled something on his clipboard, and walked away. Gary's grin vanished as the inspector drove off without issuing a single ticket. The neighborhood was furious. They nicknamed Bea's home the Bea Hive because of its strange textured appearance. Teenagers drove by and laughed. Brenda Carter started aggressively planting tall arborvitae shrubs along the edge of their property to block the view. Through it all, Bea just kept stacking. She knew something they didn't. She had spent decades reading weather patterns, paying attention to the way the local wildlife was behaving. The squirrels were burying their caches unusually deep. The woolly bear caterpillars were entirely black, and her joints, a reliable barometer since she was 40, were aching with a deep, unprecedented cold. Winter was coming, and it was going to be ruthless. November lured Pine Ridge into a false sense of security. The first 3 weeks were unseasonably warm. Temperatures hovered in the high 50s, and the autumn leaves clung stubbornly to the oaks. The extended warmth thoroughly fueled the neighborhood's mockery. Gary shouted across the street one afternoon while washing his truck, "Hey, Bea, good thing you built that fortress. Might hit 60 degrees tomorrow." "Molly! Don't let the wood spontaneously combust." Bea ignored him, quietly checking the seals around her cast-iron wood stove. Then, on December 12th, the atmosphere violently shifted. Meteorologists had predicted a standard Alberta clipper moving down from Canada, maybe 5 to 8 inches of snow, and a sharp drop in temperature. Standard Montana weather. But as the system crossed the Rockies, it collided with a freak pocket of Pacific moisture. It began on a Tuesday evening. The sky didn't just turn gray. It turned a bruised, sickly purple. The wind arrived first, a low, guttural howl that rattled the expensive floor-to-ceiling windows of Gary Carter modern farmhouse. By 8 p.m., the snow started falling. It didn't drift down. It drove horizontally, fired like icy buckshot by 60-mile-per-hour gusts. Inside her home, Bea felt the vibrations of the wind, but her living room was eerily quiet. The thick, dense walls of stacked tamarack and fir surrounding her house acted as a massive acoustic and thermal barrier. The wind battered the tin roof of her wraparound shed, but the snow slid harmlessly off, landing feet away from her siding. Across the street, Gary was settling into his leather recliner, streaming a movie when the lights flickered. "Wind must be knocking the lines around," Gary said to Brenda, who was wrapping Christmas presents by the gas fireplace. At 10:14 p.m., the entire valley plunged into darkness. The power grid, which Gary had so confidently praised, buckled under the weight of falling pine trees and ice-laden wires. "Damn it," Gary muttered, pulling out his phone. "It's fine. The backup generator will kick in." Outside, his generic big box store standby generator roared to life. The lights flickered back on. Gary smiled. "See? Prepared." But the storm was just clearing its throat. By Wednesday morning, 3 feet of snow had fallen, and the temperature had plummeted to 22 degrees below zero, not factoring in the wind chill. Bea woke up at dawn. Her house was chilly, resting at about 50 degrees. She warped into her kitchen, brewed a cup of instant coffee on a small camping stove, and walked to her back door. When she opened it, she was greeted by a solid wall of white. The snow had drifted 5 feet high against the back of her property, but when she opened her side door, the one protected by her wraparound shed, she stepped into a dry, clear tunnel. The tin roof had shielded the entire walkway. She reached out, grabbed 3 perfectly dry, seasoned logs of tamarack, and brought them inside. Within 20 minutes, her cast-iron stove was roaring. The heat radiated through the house. But here was the magic of Bea's hillbilly barricade. In a normal house, the bitter cold outside would rapidly suck the heat through the walls, but Bea's exterior walls were insulated by 2 feet of dense, stacked timber and an air gap. The thermal mass trapped the heat inside. By noon, her living room was a balmy 75 degrees. She sat in her armchair, knitting a sweater, perfectly at peace. Things at the Carter household were rapidly deteriorating. At 2 p.m. on Wednesday, Gary's generator abruptly choked and died. He bundled up in his designer down jacket and waded through waist-deep snow to inspect it. The fine powdery snow had blown horizontally into the generator's intake vents, melting against the hot engine and refreezing into a solid block of ice, destroying the carburetor. "It's dead," Gary told Brenda, his teeth chattering as he stepped back inside. The temperature in their massive house with its vaulted ceilings was already dropping fast. "But it's fine. We have the gas fireplace." Brenda turned the knob on the fireplace. Nothing happened. The electronic ignition system required electricity to open the gas valve. Without the generator, their luxurious modern fireplace was a useless glass box. By Thursday morning, the situation in Pine Ridge transitioned from an inconvenience to a genuine emergency. The temperature hit -35. Roads were completely impassable. The county plows had been pulled off the roads due to zero visibility. Cell towers running on battery backups began to fail. In the Carter house, it was 38 degrees in the living room. They were wearing winter coats, huddled under 3 duvets on the couch. "Gary, we have to make a fire," Brenda sobbed, her breath visible in the air. "We have that decorative fire pit outside. You bought wood for it last summer." Gary nodded numbly. He forced the front door open, fighting the snowdrift, and waded to the side of the house. He found the pile of wood he had bought from the grocery store. He had thrown a blue plastic tarp over it months ago. He pulled the tarp, but it was frozen solid to the wood. When he finally ripped it free, his heart sank. The summer rain had pooled under the cheap tarp, soaking the wood. Now the logs were encased in a thick, unbreakable shell of solid ice. Desperate, Gary grabbed an axe and tried to chop a piece free. The axe struck the frozen wood, glanced off the ice, and nearly took off his knee. He dropped the axe, his hands stinging through his gloves, and stared at the useless frozen lump of timber. He looked across the street. Through the blinding, swirling whiteout, he could see Bea's house. Smoke was billowing steadily from her stone chimney, whipping away in the wind. He could see the warm orange glow of a kerosene lantern in her window. Gary realized with a sickening pit in his frozen stomach, that the hillbilly barricade was the only thing keeping the widow alive, and that he was currently freezing to death in a $1 million icebox. By Thursday evening, the interior of the Carter custom-built farmhouse had become a tomb. The temperature inside the sprawling open-concept living room plummeted to 26 degrees. The ambient cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was predatory, seeping up through imported Italian floor tile and radiating off the massive, uninsulated panes of Gary's prized floor-to-ceiling windows. Brenna lay on the sectional sofa, buried beneath every blanket, towel, and winter coat they owned. She had stopped shivering an hour ago, a terrifying clinical sign of advancing hypothermia. Her lips held a faint, sickly bluish tint in the dim light of Gary's fading flashlight. Gary sat on the edge of the coffee table, his breath pluming in thick white clouds. He stared at a glass of water he had left on the kitchen island that morning. It was frozen solid. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. His money, his status, and his state-of-the-art smart home meant absolutely nothing right now. Nature was actively trying to kill them, and it was succeeding. A loud, violent crack echoed from the ceiling upstairs, sounding like a gunshot. The pressurized water lines in their master bathroom were bursting as the water inside them expanded into ice. Their home was literally tearing itself apart. He looked out the front window. The blizzard was still raging, a horizontal curtain of blinding white. But through the breaks in the squall, he saw it. The warm, steady yellow glow of the kerosene lantern in Beatrice Miller's window. Gary swallowed hard. The lump in his throat felt like ground glass. He had mocked her. He had called her an eyesore and tried to get the county to tear down the very structure that was currently keeping her alive. But looking at Brenda's pale, motionless face, his pride evaporated, leaving behind only raw, desperate panic. "Brenda," Gary whispered, shaking her shoulder gently. "We can't stay here. We're going to cross the street." She groaned weakly but didn't open her eyes. Knowing he couldn't carry her through waist-deep snow, he needed help. He zipped his designer down jacket to his chin, pulled on 2 pairs of gloves, and wrapped a wool scarf around his face. Opening his front door was a Herculean task. A snowdrift had sealed it shut. Gary threw his shoulder against the heavy mahogany 3 times before the frozen seal broke. The wind howled through the crack, ripping the door from his grip. The cold hit him like a wall of knives, instantly numbing his cheeks. The street was an unrecognizable, churning ocean of white. The 100 yards to Bayer's house looked like an impossible Arctic expedition. Gary stepped off his porch and sank to his upper thighs. Every step was a brutal lung burner. Halfway across the street, he stumbled over a buried mailbox and fell face first into a drift. Snow packed into his collar, melting against his neck and sending agonizing shocks down his spine. He wanted to stay there, to just close his eyes. But the image of his freezing wife forced him up. He pushed forward, his vision narrowing to the dark, textured silhouette of the beer hive. As he finally breached Bia's property line, a miracle occurred. The mud he stepped under, the wide, overhanging tin roof of her wraparound shed, the wind stopped. The massive, densely packed walls of tamarack and fir acted as an impenetrable windbreak. Under the awning there was almost no snow, just a dry path of packed dirt leading to her side door. Gary collapsed against the solid wall of firewood, gasping for air. He pounded a heavy, frozen fist against Bayer's wooden door. 10 seconds later, the deadbolt clicked. The door swung inward, and a wave of thick, comforting heat rolled over Gary, carrying the scent of dry cedar and wood smoke. Bia stood in the doorway in a thick wool sweater. She didn't look surprised, and she didn't look smug. "Gary," she said quietly. "Bay," Gary choked out, tears instantly freezing on his eyelashes. "Bay, I'm so sorry. My generator. The wood is frozen. Brenda is—" A sob tore through his chest. Bea didn't demand an apology. She simply turned and grabbed a bright orange heavy-duty plastic toboggan she kept for hauling groceries. "Take this," Bea commanded, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Put her in the sled, wrap her in a sleeping bag, and strap her down." Keep her head elevated. Go. Now. 10 minutes later, Gary was dragging the toboggan through the blizzard, his muscles screaming. Brenda was secured inside. When they reached the sanctuary of the shed's awning, Bea was waiting, door wide open. They pulled Brenda into the living room. The wall thermostat read a glorious 74 degrees. The cast-iron stove glowed with a cherry-red intensity, radiating life-saving thermal energy. Bea immediately went to work, knowing that applying direct extreme heat to severe hypothermia could cause cardiac arrest. She stripped Brenda of her freezing outer layers, wrapped her in pre-warmed wool blankets, and handed Gary a mug of lukewarm, sugary broth. "Feed this to her slowly," Bea instructed. Gary sat on the floor, hands trembling as he held the mug to his wife's lips. He looked around. May's home was a fortress of absolute preparation. A hand-crank radio sat on the counter. 5-gallon water jugs lined the wall. An hour later, Brenda's color began to return. She opened her eyes, looked at the glowing wood stove, and began to cry softly. A heavy knock sounded at the door. Bea unlocked it to reveal Dave Carmichael, the hardware store owner, clutching his 5-year-old daughter. His face was gray. "Dea," Dave panted. "My propane line froze solid. We got nothing." "Come in, Dave," Bea said. Over the next 24 hours, the eyesore of Juniper Lane became the neighborhood's ark. 6 people from 4 different households made the desperate trek. The Pattersons, whose eco-friendly heat pump had seized, arrived Friday morning. Bea welcomed them all. Her home, cocooned by 50 cords of tightly stacked timber, barely registered the apocalyptic conditions. The thermal mass absorbed heat inside, while dead air gaps between the logs outside provided impenetrable insulation. Stripped of their titles and property values, the wealthy residents of Pine Ridge were just frightened people relying entirely on the grace of the woman they had cast aside. The storm held Pine Ridge hostage for an agonizing 11 days. It was a weather event that would later be recorded in the state archives as the Great Deep Freeze, rivaling the catastrophic cold snaps of the late 1980s. On the morning of the 12th day, the wind finally died. The sickly purple clouds broke apart, revealing a piercingly bright, clear blue sky. The temperature crept up to a balmy 5 degrees above zero. Inside Bea's house, the hand-crank radio crackled to life. A static lace voice announced that the county had finally cleared the main highway, and rotary plows were making their way into the rural subdivisions. Around noon, the deep guttural rumble of heavy diesel engines echoed through the valley. A massive front-end loader, followed by a Flathead County Sheriff's SUV, breached the wall of snow at the entrance of Juniper Lane. When Sheriff Tom Abernathy stepped out of his vehicle, his boots crunching on the packed snow, he expected to find mass casualties. He had spent the last 3 days pulling frozen bodies from stranded cars and uninsulated trailers across the county. He adjusted his radio, his face grim, and waded toward the Carter house. Before he reached the porch, Gary opened Bea's side door and stepped out under the awning. Dave Carmichael and the Pattersons followed. Sheriff Abernathy stalked in his tracks, staring in disbelief as the well-fed, perfectly worn residents of Juniper Lane filed out of the bizarre, wood-encased house. "Is everyone all right?" the sheriff called out, resting his hand on his duty belt. "We're all here, Sheriff," Gary shouted back, his voice thick with emotion. "Every single one of us, because of her." He turned and looked at Bea, who was standing quietly in the doorway, a mug of tea in her hands. With the roads cleared, the reality of the aftermath set in. The residents returned to their homes to assess the damage, and it was then that the true genius of Beatrice Miller's hillbilly barricade was revealed. The devastation to the modern, expensive homes was catastrophic. In Gary's house, the burst pipes had unleashed hundreds of gallons of water into the drywall and insulation before freezing solid. The ice had expanded inside the walls, shattering the wooden studs and cracking the foundation. The pristine floor-to-ceiling windows had fractured under the immense pressure of the structural shifting. The Pattersons' home fared no better. The extreme, prolonged cold had caused a phenomenon known as frost heave. The moisture deep in the soil had frozen and expanded upward, cracking their concrete slab foundation right down the middle. Black mold was already beginning to spore in the damp, ruined insulation of Dave Carmichael's basement. Insurance adjusters flooded the neighborhood by late January. The damage across Pine Ridge was estimated in the millions. Several families facing complete rebuilds were forced to move into temporary apartments in the city. But Baya's house, it didn't have a single cracked window. Not one burst pipe, not a millimeter of foundation damage. When Craig Peterson, the county building inspector, returned to Juniper Lane in early February, he wasn't carrying a clipboard full of citations. He parked his municipal truck, walked up to Baya's door, and respectfully took off his hat. "Mrs. Miller," Craig said, looking at the solid wall of dry, perfectly preserved firewood that had saved her home, "I'm not here to write you up. The county zoning board had an emergency meeting yesterday. We're re-evaluating the building codes for emergency thermal structures. I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to share the dimensions and the framing plans for your shed. The county wants to officially approve this design for rural residents." Bay smiled softly. "There's no blueprint, Craig. It's just common sense. Keep the wood dry and let the wood keep you warm. But you're welcome to take all the pictures you want." The cultural shift in Pine Ridge was profound. The towering arbor vitae shrubs Brenda Carter had planted to block the view of Baya's house died from the frost, but she didn't replace them. She didn't want to block the view anymore. Gary and Brenda spent 6 months living in a rented condo while contractors gutted their ruined farmhouse. When they finally moved back in late August, the first thing Gary did wasn't to reinstall a smart thermostat or order a larger backup generator. Instead, a lumber truck pulled into his freshly paved driveway. Dave Carmichael delivered stacks of rough-sawn 2x4s and heavy-duty deck screws. Bea was sitting on her porch, sipping iced tea in the summer heat when Gary walked across the street. He looked humbled, tired, but fundamentally changed. He didn't wear designer boat shoes anymore. He wore a pair of scuffed leather work boots. "Bea," Gary said, scratching the back of his neck, looking a bit sheepish, "and framing out a lean-to on the north side of my house. I was wondering, if you're not too busy, could you show me how to pitch the tin roof so the snow sheds away from the foundation? I want to make sure I do it right." Bea looked at the man who had once tried to legislate her out of the neighborhood. She set her iced tea down on the railing, stood up, and grabbed her favorite framing hammer from a toolbox by the door. "Well, Gary," Bea said, her eyes crinkling with a genuine warm smile, "it's about time you learned how to properly stack a cord of wood. Let's go build a barricade." If Beatrice's incredible story of survival and old-fashioned ingenuity inspired you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates real-life resilience. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable true stories, survival tactics, and everyday heroes outsmarting the odds. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Stay warm, stay prepared, and we'll see you in the next video.